Every Thursday morning, just as the sun cracks over the frost line, a rusted pickup truck rumbles down a dirt lane in Chenango County, New York. Its bed piled high with rotting supermarket lettuce, blackened bananas, and doughy bread. The driver is a 52-year-old woman the neighbors have nicknamed the garbage farmer. They've called the county, snapped photos, scrawled "Trash Queen" on her fence. Last March, she received a check for $120,000 from a salmon farm 3,000 miles away. The reason lives inside the rot. Her name is Diane Kowalski. For 2 years, she endured the ridicule while perfecting a method to breed black soldier fly larvae on grocery waste. The dried grubs are worth more per pound than salmon. The question that stumped everyone: how does a mountain of rotting trash produce a $120,000 check? Starts 18 months earlier, with a retired school teacher and a secret she didn't fully understand. 18 months before the first supermarket truck pulled into her lane, Diane Kowalski was a retired biology teacher living on 10 acres of hardpan soil a mile from the nearest paved road. Her husband had been gone 6 years. The vegetable garden she'd planted every spring refused to thrive, and her pension left just enough to keep the porch lights on. So when her son, an assistant manager at a grocery warehouse in Binghamton, mentioned during a Sunday visit that the store paid nearly $200 a ton to landfill produce that was too bruised to sell, Diane heard something different than a complaint. She heard free compost. She told him yes before he could finish warning her about the smell. The first load arrived on a damp morning in late September. Romaine hearts gone slimy at the base, peaches that had split open in their cardboard crates, a stack of dented soup cans someone had mixed in by mistake. Her son shrugged, helped her shovel the mess behind the barn, and told her again she was crazy. By the end of the month, the pile stood waist-high and the neighbors began to notice. At first, it was just stares from passing trucks. Then the phone calls started. Someone asked the county whether she was running an unlicensed dump. Another neighbor, a retired machinist named Ed Kowalchuk who lived half a mile east, left a handwritten note in her mailbox that read, "This is a neighborhood, not a landfill." By November, the local Facebook group had christened her the garbage farmer, and one Saturday morning she walked out to find the words "Trash Queen" sprayed across her fence in neon orange paint. She scrubbed it off without saying a word to anyone. What the neighbors couldn't see from the road was what Diane had started to notice every time she turned the pile. Thousands of small, segmented larvae, cream-colored and writhing in the rot like a single breathing muscle, were consuming the waste faster than any compost heap she'd ever tended. Black soldier fly larvae. She had taught a unit on decomposition ecology for 20 years, and the sight stopped her cold. The larvae were not a problem. They were a system. A dozen scientific papers she'd half remembered from old journals came flooding back. Dried soldier fly grubs ran 40 to 42% protein and 35% fat, a near-perfect feed for salmon, poultry, and swine. The global fish meal industry was desperately searching for alternatives as wild stocks collapsed. She began experimenting in an old chest freezer she'd gutted and converted into a breeding chamber. She logged temperature, humidity, and waste-to-larvae conversion rates in a spiral notebook. Most batches died in the first week. Everything smelled like ammonia and failure. But a handful survived, and those she dried in a low oven and ground into a coarse brown meal that smelled earthy and faintly sweet. In the third month, she drove a sample to a feed testing lab in Ithaca. The lab director called 2 days later and asked where she'd sourced material with that protein profile. Diane realized for the first time that she might be sitting on something worth far more than free compost. But the county had already opened a file. A code enforcement officer named Marjorie Phelps showed up at the gate one afternoon with a clipboard and a citation for illegal solid waste disposal. She gave Diane 30 days to clear the pile or face fines that would swallow half a year's pension. Diane looked at the larvae, at the notebook full of data, at the fence that still bore faint orange smears from the night before, and understood that she was running out of time to prove the value in the rot. Diane called the county the next morning and asked to speak to Marjorie Phelps directly. The conversation lasted 6 minutes. Phelps was polite but firm. The citation wasn't personal. Solid waste stored on agricultural land without a permit violated township code, and the pile behind Diane's barn, now measured by an inspector at 11 feet wide and 4 feet high, required removal. Diane tried to explain that the pile wasn't waste anymore. It was feed. It was substrate. Inside that decaying produce, millions of larvae were converting garbage into protein at a rate that would outperform any composting facility in the state. Phelps paused, and for a moment Diane thought she'd found an opening. Then Phelps asked if she had a state permit for animal feed production. Diane didn't even know that permit existed. The silence on the line told her everything the inspector didn't say. The 30-day clock was still running. She drove to the county extension office that afternoon and spent 4 hours reading every regulation she could find on Class A animal feed, insect husbandry, and commercial food waste processing. The binders on the shelf were thicker than her old biology textbooks. She discovered that black soldier fly larvae fell into a regulatory gray zone. The state had guidelines for poultry litter and composted manure, but nothing that explicitly covered insect larvae raised on food scraps. A friendly extension agent named Carla admitted she'd never fielded a question like Diane before and suggested she file a research exemption while the rules caught up. Filing the exemption would pause the citation, but it required a commercial partner willing to sponsor the project. Without one, the pile was just a pile, and the 30 days would expire. That night, Diane emailed the lab director in Ithaca who had tested her first batch. She explained the citation, the 30-day window, and the larvae's conversion rate in terms she hoped a scientist would respect. Subject line: Is soldier fly protein worth fighting a county over? The reply arrived at 6 the next morning. The subject line was one word: yes. The body of the email contained an introduction to a man named Lars Bergstrom, head of sustainable sourcing at a Norwegian salmon farming company called Fjordfeed. They were looking for an American producer who could supply insect meal at scale to offset rising fish meal costs. Bergstrom would be in New York for an aquaculture conference in 10 days and would be willing to meet. 10 days out of 30. Diane felt the math tighten around her ribs. She drove back to the farm, mixed a fresh batch of waste into the bin, and called her son. He came the same evening, still wearing his warehouse uniform. She hadn't asked him for help before, but she needed someone to understand what was happening in case the county moved faster than the Norwegian. He stood beside the bin in the fatting light, watching the larvae churn through a layer of spoiled mangoes, and for the first time didn't call her crazy. He asked if she needed money for a lawyer. She shook her head. She needed time. The next 10 days passed in a haze of frantic preparation. Diane dried enough larvae to fill 3 vacuum-sealed bags, each the size of a loaf of bread. She typed up a report summarizing her data: waste input weights, larval harvest weights, protein analysis from the lab, energy costs, growth rates at different temperatures. She included a photograph of Ed Kowalczuk's mailbox note, not because she wanted sympathy, but because she wanted Bergstrom to understand the resistance she was up against. Then she deleted the photograph and replaced it with a line about community education potential, because the former biology teacher in her knew that a salmon executive probably responded better to professionalism than to grievance. Bergstrom met her in the lobby of a hotel near Syracuse. He was younger than she'd expected, mid-30s, with the kind of tired eyes that suggested he'd spent years trying to make fish farming sustainable. She handed over the bags and the report. He opened one, sniffed the coarse brown powder, and asked the question she hadn't prepared for. How quickly could she scale to 5 tons a month? 5 tons. Her operation was producing maybe 40 pounds of dried larvae a week if every batch survived. She told him the truth. He didn't flinch. Fjordfeed was willing to fund a pilot facility if she could demonstrate a viable production model in a real-world setting. Not a lab, not a warehouse, but a working farm with a steady waste stream. He gestured toward the report in his hands and said, "This is the first time I've seen a retired teacher produce data like this from a pile of garbage." If she could secure the property, meet zoning requirements, and produce a consistent initial batch of 1,000 pounds of dried meal within 4 months, Fjordfeed would cut her a purchase order for $120,000. Back at the farm, the pile behind the barn had shrunk by almost a third, consumed by the larvae's round-the-clock appetite. But the orange paint on the fence still showed through a fresh coat of whitewash, and Marjorie Phelps had left a second voicemail. The citation wasn't paused. The research exemption hadn't been filed because Diane still didn't have a domestic partner to co-sign the paperwork. Bergstrom's offer was generous, but it was contingent, and contingencies couldn't stop a township board from declaring her land a public nuisance. If she didn't remove the pile within 3 weeks, the county would do it for her and send her the bill. The irony was so sharp it almost made her laugh. The thing that could pay for the farm, that could turn 10 acres of hardpan into something legitimate, was classified as trash until proven otherwise. And then Ede Kowalchuk circulated a petition. 47 signatures from surrounding properties demanding the township enforce the citation immediately. The board scheduled a hearing for the following Monday. Diane stood in the barn with the larvae hum working in the background and remembered something Bergstrom had said about Norway's regulations. The European Union had already approved insect meal for aquaculture feed. The United States was slower, but approval had come through just 6 months earlier for salmon. She wasn't just fighting the township. She was racing an industry that was already shifting beneath her feet. If she failed here, someone else would figure out the model she'd practically handed them. The only difference would be that her name wouldn't appear on a single patent, a single contract, a single bag of feed. She picked up the phone and called the one person she hadn't spoken to in 10 years, a former colleague at the university who now sat on a state agricultural board. The hearing was 6 days away, and the pile, however diminished, still needed to look like opportunity instead of offense. She picked up the phone and called the one person she hadn't spoken to in 10 years, a former colleague at the university who now sat on a state agricultural board. Helen Reeves answered on the third ring, and Diane didn't bother with small talk. She outlined the citation, the petition, the 30-day window that was now down to 6, and the Norwegian executive who had promised her a 6-figure contract if she could prove the larvae weren't just an experiment. Helen listened without interrupting, then said 3 words that Diane hadn't realized she needed to hear. "I believe you." Helen drove out the next morning from Albany. She wore practical boots and carried a digital pH meter in her bag. For 2 hours she walked the property, examined the gutted chest freezer now retrofitted with heating mats and ventilation tubing, and watched the larvae reduce a fresh bucket of spoiled kale to dark, crumbly frass. She took swabs from the drying racks and sealed them in sterile vials. By the time they sat down at Diane's kitchen table, Helen had already emailed the state ag commissioner's office with a preliminary finding. The operation was not waste disposal. It was a contained bioconversion system with measurable agricultural output. The commissioner, Helen explained, had authority to issue a provisional research designation that would preempt the township citation, but only if a credible third party co-signed the application. And that third party couldn't be Fjordfeed, because the commissioner's office was wary of foreign corporate interests steering policy. It had to be a domestic institution, a university, an extension program, a recognized nonprofit. Diane felt the old frustration rise. She had spent 2 decades teaching at a state college, but retirement had severed her institutional ties. Helen said she'd make calls. She still had friends in the entomology department at Cornell. If someone there would agree to sponsor the project as a field research site, the commissioner could sign off within 48 hours. They'd have the letter before the Monday hearing. But the hearing was now 5 days away, and Cornell's bureaucracy didn't move on emergency timelines for retired teachers the trustees had never heard of. The next complication arrived in the form of a reporter from the Binghamton Press and Sun Bulletin. Her name was Carla Munoz, and she'd gotten a tip from Ede Kowalchuk about the garbage farm that was dividing the township. She wanted a comment. Diane invited her to visit, reasoning that a fair story was better than a hit piece written from Ede's petition alone. Carla showed up with a photographer, and Diane walked her through the bin system, the larvae's life cycle, the protein data from the Ithaca lab, and the Fjord feed offer. She showed Carla the original citation and explained that the pile the neighbors were complaining about had shrunk by 2/3 because the larvae consumed faster than rot could spread. The photographer took pictures of the drying racks, the vacuum-sealed bags of finished meal, the neat rows of plastic bins labeled by date and waste source. Diane thought she'd made her case. The article ran the following Thursday under the headline "Trash Queen or Pioneer. Neighbors divided over stinky insect farm." It quoted Ed Kowalchuk at length. He claimed the smell had attracted raccoons and rats, that standing water from the waste bins had bred mosquitoes, that his property value had dropped by 15%. The article included a pull quote from a township board member who said, "We have zoning rules for a reason. You can't just pile up grocery store garbage and call it farming." Diane's side of the story appeared in the final third of the piece, after most readers had already formed an opinion. The grocery warehouse manager called her son that evening, nervous about the publicity. If the chain's corporate office caught wind that their waste was fueling a neighborhood controversy, they'd pull the supply contracts and find another disposal route. Her son promised to manage it, but Diane heard the strain in his voice. The delicate chain of free feedstock that made her operation economically viable was suddenly pulling taut. Then Bergstrom called. He'd been forwarded the article by a board member in Oslo who'd found it through a Google alert. The Norwegian board was not pleased. They wanted to know why their candidate supplier was making headlines for code violations and neighborhood feuds. Bergstrom asked Diane the question she'd been dreading. If the township shut her down, what was her contingency plan? She didn't have one. She had 10 acres of family land, a barn full of insect larvae, and a public narrative that now defined her as a nuisance rather than an innovator. He gave her 48 hours to present a community engagement strategy, and a legal pathway to compliance, or Fjord feed, would move on to a rival operation in Texas that was already scaling its production. The 47 signatures on Ed's petition had now grown to 63. Someone had printed copies and left them at the feed store, the gas station, and the church bulletin board. A woman Diane had never met approached her in the grocery store parking lot and told her she should be ashamed, turning a quiet farming road into a dump. Diane drove home, sat in the barn, and watched the larvae work through a layer of coffee grounds and watermelon rinds. The irony sat bitter in her throat. These creatures were processing waste more efficiently than any municipal facility in the region, emitting a fraction of the methane, producing a high-value protein that could reduce pressure on wild fish stocks. And yet the community saw nothing but the pile. Helen called late that night. She'd found a researcher in Cornell's Sustainable Agriculture program, a young professor named Daniel Okonkwo, who agreed to submit the co-sponsorship letter if he could tour the site first. He could come on Saturday, 2 days before the hearing. Diane said yes before she'd finished the sentence. On Saturday morning, Okonkwo arrived in a mud-spattered Subaru, reviewed her data, took duplicate samples, and confirmed what Helen had already reported. The bioconversion rates were exceptional. He signed the letter on her kitchen table. Helen forwarded it to the commissioner's office with a request for expedited review. The commissioner's aide promised a decision by Monday morning, hours before the hearing. But when Monday arrived, the letter hadn't come. Diane called Helen at 7 a.m., then again at 8. The commissioner's office was waiting on a final legal review, a technicality about whether the designation could retroactively nullify an active citation. The hearing was scheduled for 9. She threw the vacuum-sealed bags of dried larvae and the binder of lab reports into the passenger seat and drove to the township hall. The parking lot was already full. Through the window she could see Ed Kowalchuk in the front row, arms folded, flanked by neighbors who had signed his petition. She swallowed hard and walked inside, clutching a product worth $120,000 that the room still believed was garbage. The hearing was called to order by Township Supervisor Barbara Glenn, a woman with short gray hair and a gavel she used more often than necessary. Ed Kowalchuk spoke first. He read from a prepared statement, his voice even but edged with the particular anger of someone who believes he is defending the moral order of a place. He described the smell again, the trucks arriving at odd hours, the raccoons he swore he'd seen dragging spoiled mangoes across his lawn. When he finished, he sat down to a ripple of nods from the rows behind him. Supervisor Glenn turned to Diane and asked if she wanted to respond before the board deliberated. Diane stood. She carried the vacuum-sealed bags and the binder with 12 months of data to the front table and laid them down. She didn't read from a statement. She opened the binder and began explaining, calmly, exactly what happened to the produce after it was dumped behind her barn. She described the black soldier fly life cycle, the bioconversion rate, the 42% protein content in the dried larvae. She held up a bag of coarse brown powder and told the room this was not garbage. It was a commercial aquaculture feed worth more per pound than the salmon it would nourish. The room shifted. A few people leaned forward. Barbara Glenn asked what any of that had to do with the citation. Diane said the citation had been written for a waste pile that no longer existed. The material on her property was agricultural feedstock, intentionally managed, scientifically documented, and tied to a pending purchase order from a major international seafood company. Marjorie Phelps, seated at the side of the room with her clipboard, spoke up. She acknowledged that the property had changed since her last visit but noted that the citation was issued based on conditions at the time. Whether those conditions had improved didn't erase the fact that the township code had been violated. The board could reduce the fine, she suggested, but the pile still needed to be legitimized through proper channels. The supervisor nodded, preparing to rule. Then the door at the back of the hall opened. Helen Reeves walked in, still wearing mud on her boots from the farm, and handed a printed letter to the supervisor without asking permission. The letter was on State Agricultural Commissioner letterhead. It designated Diane Kowalski's 10-acre property as a provisional agricultural research site under the university co-sponsorship of Cornell's Sustainable Agriculture Program. The designation carried the force of preemption over local solid waste ordinances for a period of 18 months, renewable upon review. Barbara Glenn read it in silence, then read it again. She handed it to the township attorney, who scanned the text and gave a small, reluctant nod. The supervisor folded the letter carefully and placed it beside the gavel. She announced that the citation would be dismissed, effective immediately, contingent on the state designation remaining active. The board would revisit the matter in 12 months. There would be no fines. Diane exhaled. Across the aisle, Ed Kowalczuk's arms stayed folded, but his jaw tightened. The people behind him didn't applaud or cheer, but they didn't complain either. Something in the room had shifted from suspicion to silence, the kind of silence that comes when people realize they've been watching something they didn't understand. The next 3 months were a blur of construction and calibration. Diane used a small advance from Fjordfeed to build a climate-controlled breeding shed with professional-grade bins, timed lighting, and an automated drying system. She trained her son to manage the grocery-warehouse relationship, which had survived the newspaper scare after the chain's sustainability team reviewed her operation and decided they wanted to be associated with it, not distanced from it. The first commercial batch, 1,000 pounds of dried black soldier fly meal in 50-pound bags stamped with a provisional label, shipped from Chenango County in a temperature-controlled freight truck bound for a port in New Jersey. 2 weeks later, an envelope arrived from Oslo. Inside was a check for $120,000. Diane walked to the barn, sat on the same overturned bucket where she'd once tasted a spoonful of vinegar-like compost tea and laughed until her eyes burned. The neighbors noticed the check before they noticed the science. Ed Kowalczuk phoned her on a Tuesday afternoon. He didn't apologize for the petition or the orange spray paint. He asked, as if he were inquiring about a tractor for sale, whether the operation was accepting investors. 2 other families on the same road called within the week, wanting to know how they could convert their own waste streams into something sellable. Diane told them she wasn't selling shares. She was selling feed. But she offered to take their compost and pay them back in dried meal for their chickens, and some of them actually said yes. The same woman who had confronted her in the grocery store parking lot now bought meal for her laying hens at the feed store that stocked Diane's product under a brand called Grubworks. The name Trash Queen faded from the fence, but Diane left a faint orange ghost of it visible beneath the whitewash because it reminded her of something her grandmother Ruth had never met but would have understood. 1 year after the hearing, Grubworks was processing 12 tons of grocery store waste per month, employed 3 full-time staff, and supplied insect meal to 3 aquaculture companies across 2 continents. Diane was invited to speak at a conference in Portland, where she stood on a stage in front of 400 people and told them the story of a retired biology teacher who had been called a garbage farmer. She held up the original citation, now framed, and said it was the best thing anyone had ever done for her business. The room laughed, but she wasn't joking. The resistance had forced her to build something public enough that no one could ignore it. The neighbors who once slowed their trucks to stare at the pile now waved when they passed. Ed Kowalchuk, it turned out, had excellent mechanical skills and was hired part-time to maintain the drying equipment. He never spoke about the orange paint, and neither did Diane. The larvae, indifferent to human grievance, kept eating. The story might have ended there, a local teacher's unlikely triumph, except for the thing Diane discovered in her 4th year of operation, entirely by accident, that made the larvae worth more than just protein. And once she realized what the frass could do, everything she thought she was building became something else entirely. The frass, the fine dark residue the larvae left behind after consuming the waste, turned out to be a soil amendment so packed with chitin and nitrogen-fixing bacteria that a single application in a Cornell field trial doubled broccoli yields without a drop of synthetic fertilizer. Diane hadn't planned for that. She'd been so focused on the protein that she'd nearly given the frass away as bulk compost. Now she sells it for $6 a pound to organic farms across 3 counties, and the revenue from the frass alone covers her entire payroll. The thing the neighbors once called garbage had quietly split itself into 2 income streams that neither the township nor the salmon industry had predicted. That's the real shape of the story. Not just a check for $120,000, but a pattern that keeps repeating wherever someone is willing to look at what everyone else has already discarded and ask one more question. Diane left a faint orange smear of Trash Queen on her fence for a reason. She wanted anyone who slowed down on the county road to see that the label people give you doesn't determine what the thing is worth. It only measures what they couldn't see yet. If this story shifted something in the way you think about waste, about patience, about the things you've been told are too messy or too late to save, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments about a time you overlooked something that later proved its value. Share this with someone who needs to hear that the best opportunities rarely arrive looking like one. And as always, let us know where in the world you're watching from tonight. We'll see you in the next one.